What's going on, everyone? So, we need to talk about something that's been dominating the news cycle for years now. But I feel like a lot of people still don't fully understand why it's happening. I'm talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And look, I know this is a heavy topic, but stick with me here because once you understand the real motivations behind this war, so much of what's happening in the world right now starts to make sense. See, most people think this is just about land, or maybe Putin being power-hungry, and yeah, that's part of it. But the truth is way more complicated and honestly, way more interesting than what you're probably hearing on the evening news. So let's break this down. Alright, first things first. Let's talk about Russia's biggest insecurity, and I mean this literally, its geography. If you look at a map of Russia, it's absolutely massive, right? Largest country in the world. But here's the thing most people don't realize. Most of Russia is basically impossible to invade because of the terrain. We're talking frozen tundra, massive forests, huge mountain ranges. But there's one massive exception, the European side, specifically the North European plain. This is basically flat, open land that stretches from France all the way to the Ural Mountains in Russia. And throughout history, this has been Russia's vulnerability. Napoleon invaded through here. Hitler invaded through here. And every single time Russia got invaded, millions of people died. So for centuries, Russian leaders, whether they were Tsars, Soviet premiers, or now Putin, have been obsessed with creating buffer zones. They want distance between Moscow and potential invaders. And guess what sits right in the middle of that vulnerable zone? Ukraine. Now, let's talk about NATO, because this is where things get really tense. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, all these Eastern European countries that had been under Soviet control started joining NATO. Poland joined. The Baltic states joined. Countries were basically lining up to get under that Western security umbrella. And from Russia's perspective, this looked like the West was slowly encircling them. Now, you might say, well, NATO is a defensive alliance, they're not going to invade Russia. And you'd probably be right. But put yourself in Putin's shoes for a second. He grew up as a KGB officer during the Cold War. He sees NATO as an adversary, not a friend. And when Ukraine started making noise about wanting to join NATO too? That was a red line for him. Because if Ukraine joins NATO, that means NATO troops and missiles could potentially be stationed right on Russia's doorstep, less than 300 miles from Moscow. That's closer than New York is to Virginia. For Putin, that's an existential threat. But it's not just about military strategy. There's this whole historical and cultural element that Americans don't really appreciate. Because we don't have anything comparable in our own experience. In Russian historical thinking, Ukraine isn't really a separate country. I know that sounds crazy to us, but hear me out. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was actually the birthplace of the first Russian state back in the 9th century, a place called Kievan Rus. So in Russian nationalist mythology, Ukraine is like the motherland, the cradle of Russian civilization. Putin has literally written essays about this, arguing that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. He sees Ukrainian independence as this artificial construct created by the West to weaken Russia. Now, obviously, Ukrainians completely disagree with this narrative. They see themselves as a distinct nation with their own language, culture, and identity. But Putin? He's not interested in that perspective. Okay, now let's talk money, because there's an economic angle here too that doesn't get enough attention. Ukraine isn't just strategically located, it's also incredibly resource-rich. We're talking about some of the most fertile farmland on the planet. Ukraine used to be called the breadbasket of Europe. They're one of the world's top grain exporters. But beyond agriculture, there are also significant natural gas deposits in eastern Ukraine and in the waters around Crimea. And this matters because Russia's entire economy is basically built on selling oil and gas to Europe. If Ukraine started developing their own gas fields and supplying Europe, that's direct competition for Russia's main source of revenue and political leverage. And finally, we have to talk about Putin himself. Because this war is very much about one man's vision of history and his place in it. Putin has been in power for over 2 decades now. He's 72 years old. And everything he's said and written suggests he sees himself as a historical figure. Who's supposed to restore Russia to greatness? To undo what he sees as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Putin, allowing Ukraine to drift into the Western orbit isn't just a geopolitical loss. It's a personal failure. It's proof that Russia is weak, that he's not the strong leader he's presented himself as. And for an authoritarian leader whose entire brand is built on strength and national pride? That's unacceptable. So when you put all of this together, the geographic paranoia, the NATO expansion, the historical grievances, the economic interests, and Putin's personal obsessions, you start to understand why this war happened. It's not just one thing. It's this perfect storm of factors that have been building for decades. And here's the thing that's really scary. Because these motivations are so deeply rooted in Russian strategic thinking and national identity, this conflict isn't something that's going to be resolved quickly or easily. Even if Putin weren't in power tomorrow, many of these concerns would still exist for whoever comes after him. Anyway, that's my breakdown of what's really driving this conflict. Let me know in the comments what you think I missed or got wrong. And if you found this helpful, hit that like button and subscribe because I'm going to keep making videos breaking down complicated world events in a way that actually makes sense.